Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malde, Senior Policy Analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal and I chat with Camille Mackler, the founder and executive director of Immigrant ARC, or IARC, a collaborative of over 80 legal service providers in New York State. IARC works with community leaders, legal service providers, state and local governments, law enforcement agencies, and federal agencies and policymakers to ensure immigrants have access to a fair and efficient immigration system. We discuss IARC's beginnings, the challenges it faces, its work helping newly arrived immigrants get work permits, and how federal, state, and local governments can help. This is vital work, so stay tuned. Immigrants often face significant challenges and barriers when coming to a new country, from language and cultural differences to navigating complex legal and bureaucratic systems. The Immigrant Advocates Response Collaborative, or IARC, works to increase access to justice for all immigrant New Yorkers by mobilizing New York's legal representatives. Today, Theresa and I are very fortunate to be joined by Camille Mackler, the founder and executive director of IARC. Prior to launching IARC in 2017, Camille was the Director of Immigration Legal Policy at the New York Immigration Coalition, where she led advocacy campaigns to improve laws and policies for the benefit of immigrants across New York State. Camille has led several important campaigns and efforts, including advocating for and ultimately helping coordinate the evacuation of thousands of Afghans after the Taliban takeover in 2021. And coordinating legal efforts to respond to the busing of migrants to New York City and New York State since 2022. Camille is a frequent lecturer on topics of immigration law and policy and has authored numerous reports, op-eds, and articles on federal immigration policy. She has also testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the New York State Legislature, and the New York City Council on issues affecting immigrants, and has argued cases before U.S. federal courts of appeals and U.S. immigration courts. So with that lengthy bio out of the way, welcome to the podcast, Camille.
Thank you for having me.
Right, so let's start with a bit more about IARC. So can you tell us about IARC's beginnings and its mission today?
Sure. So IARC comes out of the response to the Muslim ban, specifically at JFK Airport, when I and a few hundred other lawyers ended up at the airport that first morning of the ban, and then stayed for 10 days looking for ways to push back and to protect those who are trying to return to the country or fly to the country who are being affected by those policies. And we had already, as a legal service field in New York, sort of realized that we were going to have to find new ways to work together. We knew we were approaching several years of hard policies and places where our work was going to need to be stepped up, and we knew that we would have to lean on each other and share resources and share knowledge and brainstorming in better and more structured ways. So we came together after the effort at JFK Airport, and we started finding ways to work together, and that took a lot of different shapes. But today, here we are, 7 years later, over 7 years later, still doing it, still going strong.
So, looking at IARC today, what are the main issues that IARC focuses on, and what work does IARC do in those areas?
So our big overarching goal is always to create better community amongst providers, so that they can support each other, and in this time of just crushing need, not reinvent the wheel, but rather use all the resources available to them and to build capacity in a sustainable and long-term way. The issues really, can vary from moment to moment. It feels like sometimes we really try to be nimble and try to pivot whenever is needed to whatever the needs are in front of us. I'd say currently, certainly being in New York, our biggest issue right now is the spike in arrivals at the southern border and how those have then, through various means, ended up coming up to New York City and New York State, and trying to meet that need while also serving the communities that have been here for a long time, and always with the goal of improving the system overall for everyone.
So can you just say a little bit more about, what needs do the immigrants have? What sort of things are you doing for them?
Sure. So overall, right, we're still dealing with a system that is very opaque, that is very backlogged, that is very clogged. And so just trying to help people navigate that regardless of how long they've been here. But certainly there's been a big focus recently in the recent arrivals. And so these are individuals who are arriving in New York City, usually to start with in New York City, for the most part, living in shelters. There's been a huge change in demographics, at least for people coming to New York City, and I believe at the border as well. When I think back, when I started my career 20 years ago, people who came through the border were mostly men traveling alone from Central and other parts of Latin America. And then we just saw this sort of phasing in of bringing in mothers, children, unaccompanied children. And today it's first of all, it's people from all over the world. It's not just those Spanish speaking countries. It's families, it's individuals, it's single men, it's single women, children, all sorts of different configurations. But the biggest issue that we're really dealing with is that it feels like, for the more so than at any other point that I can remember in the 20 years that I've been doing this kind of work, is people who are arriving here with no connections to the city, to the country, to the state, to anything. It used to be that everyone who came had somebody's phone number, right? A couch to crash on, a person to help orient them. And what we're seeing more and more is just these individuals who arrive, who have nowhere to go, who are going into shelters, who are looking for services, who are being expected to follow a process that no one really took the time to explain to them. And so that's really been where our challenge has been. And like I said, it's also just demographically where they're coming from has become so varied, and we're really struggling with language access. We're really struggling with culturally sensitive service provision when it's become just so varied from one moment to the next.
Yeah. So tell us about your role as executive director of IARC, and what do you spend your day to day on, and who are your partners?
An excellent question. Whatever needs to be done these days, I've been joking a lot that we've become a little bit of the temp agency of the legal service providers. We just kind of go where is needed and try to shore up capacity. And we're not a direct service organization. Certainly, we've found ourselves increasingly being in that space where supporting our members means actually bringing in, people who can do applications, who can do intakes. But for the most part, we really are trying to continue to grow that sense of community that launched us in the first place. One of the things that I think really helped us in those early years in 2017, 2018 is this: we were able to give providers a feeling that they weren't alone when facing all the needs that they're facing, when frustrated by whatever policies they felt were making their jobs more difficult. And we're trying to make sure that we maintain that. Right now, we're working with a field that is incredibly burnt out and tired. We're really struggling to recruit for a lot of different reasons. We're struggling to recruit more people into the field. And I think some of that is just, it feels comparative, right? It's maybe we've got as many lawyers or legal representatives, I should say, as we ever did, but we just have so many more people needing their services that it feels like the numbers are shrinking. But I also don't want to minimize the exhaustion and the burnout and the feeling of being stuck in a hamster's wheel that a lot of people have. And so thinking of ways to make them feel supported, thinking of ways to maximize every single investment. We're really lucky in New York that, even though it's not enough, we certainly have so much more invested in terms of public dollars, in terms of resources, in terms of commitments by our city and our state officials in immigration legal services. And so making sure that those investments, private investments, philanthropic investments, are maximized so that we're meeting the needs of a large number of people. And then also always, from day one, from the first days at JFK Airport, our mantra was, we have to create systems that are replicable. We have to create systems that are replicable, that can pivot, that can meet whatever the next need is, be that launching a legal effort in a county jail or out of the, flatbed of a pickup truck outside a farm parked in upstate New York, or, wherever we've done this. We just, in community centers, wherever, we just need to have systems that can be adapted, and sharing that with our colleagues around the country who maybe don't have as many resources, who maybe don't have as much of an opportunity to incubate new ideas as we have in New York. I would say also the other thing that we're really working on right now is that, given the need that we're facing for legal services, for immigration legal services, part of it is also shifting how the field thinks about what legal service delivery should look like. We used to be in a very traditional one-on-one model where you give someone a lawyer or a legal representative because that exists in immigration law, and they saw the case from beginning to end. And if we did that now, we'd barely be making a dent in what we're seeing. And so thinking about these pro se models, these limited intervention models that at least keep people on the right track, even if it doesn't look like what we as lawyers have sort of grown up believing legal services should look like.
So, Camille, you mentioned the growing numbers. What would you say are the main challenges facing IARC as an organization?
Just not being able to split ourselves into as many different pieces as it feels like we're needed. And I don't think that's specific to IARC. I think that's, true of most organizations right now. I mean, the need truly is overwhelming. And so keeping sight of what's important and what, how we define success, understanding that success is no longer going to be defined by the number of cases that you win or the outcomes or anything like that, but how many people were we able to reach through our, how many of our members were we able to reach through our members, how many people were we able to reach that way, how did we use those experiences and those moments to inform systems change. I think we've seen some really, great stuff happen that was partnerships with the city, the state, the federal government that were incubated, for lack of a better word, here in New York over the last year that hopefully are going to, take hold in other parts of the country too. And but sort of being that ability to be responsive to as much as possible while also remembering that we can't do it all and that sometimes being an immigration lawyer frankly is about providing palliative care and telling somebody that there are no options and letting them make the best choice for their life and their family and helping guide them through that. And then bringing in new partners, bringing in non-lawyers. Legal services should not be, it should not be so narrowly defined as thinking we're just talking about lawyers. A lot of different people, a lot of different sectors play into the ability to provide legal services. So how do we reach those places, those people, those groups, and train them and incorporate them into our efforts is something else that we're thinking about. And then, how do we get ready for whatever comes after November
Yeah.
or before at this point?
So, one of the big things that you've been working on, we know, for the last year in New York with these work permit. I don't know what you call them, like fairs. Maybe that's not the
Sprints.
right
Sprints.
sprints.
Yeah.
So let's dive a little bit more into that. Can you explain what are the issues here? You talked a little bit about a lot of the changing of who's arriving and that they don't have connections, but they also have different kinds of immigration cases than maybe you've traditionally seen because of maybe how they were processed at the border. So can you talk about, what are the issues they are having? Why is it so hard for so many of them to obtain work authorization or even understand what process it is they're in?
Yeah, that's such a good point you make about, people being in these different postures. I mean, we're trying so hard to lump them into these asylum seeker buckets or different kind of, traditional quote unquote definitions. And we're just seeing this new invention of all these sort of new mechanisms that are coming out a little bit out of necessity. I mean, the biggest issue is that individuals arriving at the border, that are coming here living in shelters typically don't have permission to enter the United States, right? They don't have a visa. And so without that, they don't have access to work authorization and to get work authorization through an asylum application, you have to file for asylum and it has to be pending for 6 months. There's all sorts of things that can happen in those 6 months that could cause delays and postpone that even longer. And that has caused a real, I hate to use the word crisis, but a real need in localities, right, where these individuals are coming, they're living in shelters, they can't access employment in the formal economy, they can't access services, even places like New York that do offer some benefits, health benefits, and others. Once you can get a social security number and a work authorization, they need all of that to sort of help get them on their feet and get them be self-sufficient. And so the Biden administration came up with these parole programs in a variety of ways. Some of the parole programs like United for Ukraine, like CNHV, that allows people to apply before even leaving home if they meet certain conditions. There's also to streamline what's happening at the border. They created the CBP1 app, and folks who can make appointments through CBP1 can present at the border. And they typically it's on a case by case basis, as far as I understand. But what we see is that they are allowed to enter for 2 years with this paperwork that allows them to apply for work authorization right away. And so we see people in all sorts of statuses. People here waiting for those 6 months after they applied for asylum. People, maybe applying for temporary protected status if they're from one of those countries. People here on the parole programs and just trying to, to assess where they're at. Our EAD sprints, our work permit sprints that you were referring were really aimed at individuals who'd arrived in New York City shelters via the CBP1 appointments, because at some point the city realized that they actually had a fair amount of people who were work permit eligible immediately. They did turn into helping people apply for work permits through either those parole programs or through asylum. And since then, we we did them in late September, early October. So I think we were 3 days out from our opening day when Venezuelan TPS got re-announced. And so we never touched TPS, but I do know that future efforts that grew out of that have also handled TPS, temporary protected status.
Right. So are there certain types of cases that you saw more than others during these work sprints? And you mentioned earlier there are some people that come to you that you're like, I'm sorry, I don't see a path forward here. How frequent is that and how hard is that?
So during the work sprints, we did not do any intakes or evaluations of the merits of any immigration case. I will say that we saw a lot of people. One of the biggest challenges that we had was that we had a lot of people who spoke a lot of different languages that we weren't ready to provide I mean, we had language line, but we had gotten a lot of Spanish interpreters because that's sort of what we're used to serving. We had a few French, a few Creole, because we know in New York we're going to get a lot of that, but we saw a lot of people from a lot of different African countries who didn't speak French. We saw Georgians, Russians, others from Eastern Europe. So it was the sort of the diversity of origins was noticeable during those sprints. In overall in our work since then, helping people in shelters, we work with the state and the New York Immigration Coalition to serve people who've been transferred from New York City shelters to hotels upstate to sort of decompress the New York City shelters. Through that work, through other work that I do here in the city and in my personal capacity, I would say, it's a hard question to answer, Theresa. I mean, you and I are both immigration lawyers. We've been doing this a long time. And a few years ago, I would have been like, no, this person definitely is eligible for asylum. This person isn't. And it's so hard to answer that question now. But there are definitely days where I feel like the majority of people I encounter, they don't have a strong asylum claim. Maybe they don't have one at all. Maybe there's other factors in their immigration history that makes it not possible for them to pursue options and something happened at the border that shouldn't happen. Somebody was allowed in who maybe in other times would have been turned away, but it complicates their case procedurally now that they're here. There are other times when we see people who might have been a US citizen and didn't know it, or may have, we're seeing a lot of youth who are eligible for special immigrant juvenile status, and who don't know, because in New York you can apply for a SIJ up to 21 years old. Most states it's 18, but in New York it's 21. And so they come in at 19, 20, not realizing they have this option. And then you just see people who, you hear the same story for the fifth time that day, and you know that they were told to say something, and then you just sort of try to figure out if there's something more and try to advise them accordingly. So it's a mixed bag.
Camille, can you just clarify something for me? Because you mentioned the parole programs. A lot of
Mhm.
people are applying for parole, as you said, before they reach the United States. So you mentioned most of your work, it takes place inside the United States. So what exactly are you doing for these applicants?
Yeah, I probably spoke about that a little too fast. So those who are applying for the parole programs like United for Ukraine and CNHV, which is Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, Venezuela, who can, they can have a sponsor, they can come to the United States and be paroled, and they typically don't come to us for work authorization or anything else. We have done work with Ukrainians, with sponsors, and those individuals, and we do encounter them when they're trying to figure out what their long-term options might be. When I was talking about parole programs, I was sort of lumping in the CBP One app, which is of course not a parole program. And I should be more precise with my wording. I apologize, but has the same effect of individuals entering the United States with a length of parole that's long enough that they can apply for work authorization based on that.
Okay, great to have that clarification. And I just want to ask as well, because I'm wondering, what do these sprints actually look like? If I were there, what does it look like? Is it everyone in a room? People in lines who are waiting to be served? Can you kind of paint a picture for us?
Yeah, they're by appointment. And there's actually been that model has sort of been made semi-permanent in a pop-up location that the city is running out of John Jay College, which is one of our local public universities. And those two are by appointment. So they're by appointment. They were uniquely for folks who were living in shelters. So the city, through the contractors who run the shelters with them, they were making appointments and people come in. They just get a very quick screening of eligibility for work authorization up front. And then they are brought to a room where we have volunteers, legal volunteers or non-legal volunteers. We use lawyers and non-lawyers for the application assistance, and they they complete the forms. And then a supervising attorney reviews them just to make sure that they're okay. And then during those sprints, one of the big unique sort of defining features of them was that it was in partnership with the federal government. So the federal government had brought individuals who could accept and issue a receipt for the application, and could then capture their biometrics, because of course everyone over 14 has to have biometrics captured. And then they would adjudicate the fee waiver, because these types of work permits applications, you normally have to pay a fee. And so we had devised a system to sort of streamline how to request a waiver of that fee for individuals living in shelters, and that gets adjudicated on the spot. So really the only thing that's missing is actually processing the work permit, sending it over, of course, to the Social Security Administration for issuance of a Social Security number. But for folks who are, in unstable housing, the shelters, when we were doing it, I think they were down to 60-day stays, but now they're down to even less, and it sort of keeps getting clawed back. And so these are individuals who we can't have faith will continue to have access to their work. To their address for long periods of time. And so it was key to sort of get them through as much of the process as we could in the moment. Today, it's evolved a little bit. It's become, those work permits still need to be filed on paper. And so, like I said, they've actually created a semi-permanent location for this kind of work at John Jay College in New York City. And wherever we can, us and others are trying to file online. You can't file online and ask for a fee waiver. So those applications where we have to request the fee waiver, we still have to do by paper, but everyone else we're trying to do online to address that concern of people not having access to their mail and, having to move around addresses and losing things and such.
So, what do you think have been your biggest successes to date with these efforts, and where is the biggest still challenge remaining?
I think the success and the challenge is the same, which is sort of, I alluded to this earlier, but it's reframing how we provide legal services, right? It's really hard as a lawyer to see somebody and not see the case through and not anticipate all of the different issues that are going to come up and want to be there. But at the same time, if we focus on that, then we're just, there's just too much need for that. And the impermanence of housing situations, of where folks are, right? They're moving around the country even a lot more. The policies are changing so much, so that's making it harder. So I think on one hand, there's been a lot of innovation. There's been a lot of increase in working to get people to use online tools, even individuals like a couple of years ago, when we were sort of adapting to doing things more online because of the pandemic, and we were really struggling to figure out how to serve individuals who were, computer illiterate, if not entirely illiterate, which we are encountering still a fair number of folks. But now, or who just didn't have access to the technology that they would need to follow their cases. Now we're doing that. And I think that that's been a big success, is thinking through how we serve huge numbers in short time spans through these more segmented efforts. And then the next sort of version of that is, how do we equip them to see their cases through, regardless of whether they're able to achieve, to find legal representation, or if they're going to see this whole thing out on their own. We do have other sort of tangential programming that we bring into this. We run a front of the court program at Immigration Court, which helps us, we don't enter appearances, but we bring in volunteers, and those volunteers make sure that individuals' cases sort of stay on track and that they understand what the next steps are required of them. We're working on creating all sorts of different supporting evidence packets and how-to guides to sort of help them continue to navigate the case and hopefully triage out a little bit, so that the cases that do end up with legal representation are really the ones that require that level of expertise. I mean, that sounds sort of off, because I think all immigration cases at this point require expertise, but, trying to sort of at least make sure that the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable are getting the help they need.
And Camille, are there any plans to scale up these services beyond New York? And if so, how will IARC be involved in these efforts, if at all?
Yeah. So after they did them in New York, they went to Denver, I believe Boston and Chicago are the ones that I'm aware of. I think possibly Philadelphia and LA as well, but I'm less sure of that. But there was a lot of interest. And then I know that they've also created some at the border, that they've created some, I think Brownsville maybe, that they've created some of these pop-up locations as well. So we had put together, we created all of these SOPs and resources. We put that in a folder. We shared it with everyone. We teamed up with the National Partnership for New Americans and PNA and others to do a webinar that had, I think, over 600 people sign up, and over 300 people show up. And I think that just speaks to the volume of people who knew it might be coming to them or would like to encourage that kind of effort in their communities. And we've, tried to share the resources, and we've tried to share the learning. And that's sort of, we're a New York organization. We're never going to be anything more than a New York organization. If we expand, it'll be across areas of law, not across state lines. But we're part of a much bigger ecosystem, and we want to be supportive of our colleagues. And like I said at the beginning, we're lucky in New York. We have way more resources than in many places. We're a good microcosm of the country, right? Like we've got this like incredibly resourced, comparatively resourced location in New York City that has access to a lot of like law firm help and pro bono help. And also, politically tends to be a little bit more friendly towards these issues. Although I would say that maybe a little nuanced these days, but in general, right? We just have we were turning volunteers away for these work permit clinics, which was just so gratifying to see that New Yorkers were standing up and wanting to welcome. But then, some folks are getting bused upstate, and then we're talking about a completely different political climate, and very rural areas, great distances, a lot of, xenophobia and things that make immigrants afraid of leaving home. And so I think we're a good microcosm for what the rest of the country looks like, which makes us a great place to incubate these ideas, work out the kinks, and then we work with our partners across the country through the various coalitions to help them stand up whatever version of what we did makes sense in their communities.
Well, great. I think we should probably take a quick break, but when we come back, more from Camille.
Welcome back. We're here with Camille Mackler, the executive director of IARC, talking about the new models of providing immigrant legal services in New York. So, Camille, what difficulties have you seen, or are you seeing that localities still face in addressing the needs of new immigrant arrivals, and how are they adapting?
I would say there's three major needs. The first one is housing, and that's sort of where this is all coming from. We don't have enough affordable housing, and that's not an immigrant specific problem. It's not a New York specific problem, but that is what is leading to a lot of instability, of a lot of reliance on public housing, on shelters and such. The second one is working with individuals who are confronting a very opaque and difficult to navigate system without legal resources to help them do that. And their pitfalls are immense, of course, if they sort of don't do something they were supposed to do. But also it delays their access to work authorization, it delays their access to long-term status, it delays their access to being able to reunite with family. A lot of things flow from that. And then I'd say the third is language access. I've sort of been saying it over and over and over again on this podcast, but it's not just Spanish speakers. I mean, not that we always had a ton of services in Spanish, but certainly more than in other languages. And we're dealing with languages that are not as common, sometimes not even written, where, like I said, the African languages, some of the indigenous languages from Central and South America are not, it's harder to find interpreters. We've even struggled with Haitian Creole interpreters, who can help. And so the language access, because that's just a barrier to everything.
And other things that the federal, state, and local governments can do to help?
On a practical, everyday level, I think there's been so much tension that has been created by these issues, and it's become very political. And, I said earlier, I don't want to use the word crisis. I mean, there is a crisis. It feels very politically created. I think if we think of this moment as an investment in our long term economic security, that would probably ease the pressure that we all feel right now to meet the needs. It would ease the pressure on city leaders, state leaders to free up resources to respond to this moment. And it would also make what feels obvious to me, but I know isn't always the case, right? Which is that we know that immigrants reinvest in their receiving communities once they're able to, and that the economic benefits are incredible, not to mention the social, cultural, political, civic, benefits as well. But I mean, in New York, you look at upstate New York, which is really, squarely in the Rust Belt and has been completely revitalized by refugee resettlement and immigrant resettlement, to the point that when the refugee numbers had been brought to such a low point in the previous White House administration, New York was trying to get refugees from other states to come to New York because of the economic benefits and that we've seen from it. So I think maybe, we talk a lot about scarcity mindset, right? But trying to sort of abandon that for a minute and understand that, yeah, it's an outlying of costs up front, but it is an investment in economic security and growth and prosperity, especially when this population isn't getting any younger. And we know, right, and the CBO just put out a report not long ago about the potential economic benefits of immigration over the next decade. And just at every level, we know that we need people in the workforce. I mean, when this all started, the New York State Department of Labor did sort of a preliminary census of where jobs might exist in New York, and they found 19,000 jobs that immediately, and they're fairly substance level jobs. But nonetheless, I mean, there was just such a need for an infusion into the labor market. So I think that's on the more like immediate day to day, just switching from that scarcity mindset to the idea that yes, there's a struggle now, but it's for there's for something much better down the road. I think in terms of the federal, state, city sort of interactions, definitely more coordination. We've heard from places around the country who sort of timidly approach us and say, we'd love to hear how you did what you did. We'd love to maybe get some folks here because for all the reasons I just said, right? Labor market needs and all of that, but we're not sure how to do it. And so maybe having the federal government step in and coordinate a little bit more and help, because I mean, I can assure you, not that I don't think New York's a great place to live. I do, obviously, but a lot of these individuals who are coming here, they're going to where, there was a bus maybe provided to them to come to New York, or they'd heard about it, or obviously who hasn't heard of New York City. And, there's a lot of their own information and misinformation that goes on, but they didn't necessarily care about being in New York, right? They just needed a place to go. And New York was, for many reasons, a known place to go. But if you told them there was a job somewhere else and there was some supports to resettle somewhere else, they probably would go. So maybe thinking a little bit more about how we can all work together to make sure that we're sharing the responsibility of receiving these newcomers, and also we all get to sort of benefit from all of the investments that they can put into our local communities. So I think that's a big part of it, that maybe at the federal government really needs to step in and give that coordination, give those resources, and also just acknowledging that people aren't going to stop coming. They're going to keep coming because they're not coming, they're leaving. Whatever we think of their reasons, they're leaving something. You don't take this trip, right? You don't spend all your life savings and maybe probably a few other family members' life savings too, and put yourself on the incredibly dangerous paths that most of these individuals take for no reason. And something that I haven't mentioned, but that we are dealing with in New York increasingly, we did for a while, it died down and starting up again, is this crossing the border between New York and Canada. And, people going north because they're afraid and they think that there's better options up north. People going to Canada and coming south. We think that had peaked, and now we think it might slow down a little bit because of some changes that Canada made. But we're also seeing that, and we're seeing people, they try to limit that at the Canadian border. They created new restrictions. They expanded restrictions created by the Safe Third Country Agreement, thinking that would slow the stream of people, the flow of people. And what we're seeing is that they're just taking more risks to, achieve the same thing. And the same thing is happening at the southern border as well.
Yeah, and Camille, at the start of the episode, you mentioned that asylum seekers have a 6-month wait before they can apply for work authorization. Is that something that you would like to see changed?
Yeah, there's a lot of things I'd like to see changed. Yeah, I think we can agree that change to the law in 1996 has, which was intended to root out fraud, clearly has not had the effect that people thought it would have, because especially when you come to the US, where you don't have access to health insurance, you don't have access to social safety net benefits, you need work authorization. People can't wait. And I say it's 6 months, but it's, first of all, it's 6 months from the day they receive your application, which is problem number one. And there are things that can delay that even more. For example, if you happen to have a court hearing that's scheduled in that 6-month period. And so you file your asylum application, you show up to court, and you tell the judge, can you give me a few weeks give me more time to find a lawyer? They stop the counting of that time. And so now, because you want to find a lawyer, you're going to have to wait even longer for a work authorization, as one fairly common example that I see. And I think that we have learned historically, and Theresa, you and I have talked about this a lot, like when you pass legislation that is extremely restrictive and punitive without also creating other solutions and pathways, then you end up in this logjam, and the 6-month wait for EADs, for work permits, is certainly, I think, a really clear example of that. And also, at the end of the day, it doesn't seem to root out fraud that much. So
In the current circumstances, it's a lot different than when that law was passed, and I think that, the capacity issues of the system to, withstand are part of the reason why we're seeing this, and it's falling on lots of localities to have to deal with it. And as you said earlier, one major difference is that previous generations of people, even people who may have wanted to apply for asylum, very frequently had some place to go, had a landing pad, if you will, even if it's just a couch to sleep on and somebody who would help them get on their feet. And they don't have that now. So absent the ability to get work authorization, they're going to work. We know that. They're going to work regardless. But their ability to support themselves and their families is going to be limited. What are IARC's plans going forward? You said you just celebrated 7 years. So for any nonprofit, that's a big deal to survive that long.
yeah. Well, 7 years as a project. We're coming on 4 as an organization.
For as an organization. But what are the next steps for IARC, and what are you planning to do next?
I don't know what comes next. We were built to be, responsive and rapid response oriented. So wherever we're needed is sort of where we're going to be. But we're trying to take the lessons learned of the last 7 years, of the last, this most recent movement, and also lessons learned from the pandemic. The pandemic really, I think, across everyone and everything, really forced us to rethink how we work, but it also opened up the possibilities of technology, dare I say, generative AI, obviously in the most ethical way possible, but just sort of thinking about how we leverage all of that to network the state in New York, to distribute resources, always with the goal of improving systems and also advocating for better systems at the legislative level. And so, right now we're ending our New York State budget season. So we're hopeful that we'll have some increases in immigration legal services funding there. We're turning to the New York City budget. That's where we're at on the advocacy front. And of course, keeping an eye on what's happening at the federal level, and always trying to continue to create systems that bring people together, help them work together, and then create building blocks for whatever comes next. But I don't know. I think what comes next, I'm hoping, is a long vacation for me and my staff. But that might still be a few years off.
I hope that comes at some point. Camille, is there anything else you want to say to listeners of the podcast?
No, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and it's always great to talk to you guys, and really appreciate the chance to highlight a little bit about what we're doing in New York. I think we're doing some really great stuff, but we want to share. So if any of your listeners want to hear more, please check out our website, reach out to us. We're here to be supportive, and we're not proprietary about what we do. We want to be able to help others do the same, wherever they are and however it looks.
Yeah, we'll be sure to put the link to your website in our podcast notes for listeners to go check out IARC. But thank you so much for being here, Camille. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Camille.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find our podcast episodes on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown, and you can follow me at Jack Malde. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malde. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.